Look at Europe today, and you see a continent divided into nations, languages, cultures, and identities that often feel as though they have existed forever. France, Spain, Italy, Germany, Britain, Greece, Scandinavia, and the nations of Eastern Europe all carry their own histories, traditions, languages, and stories about where their people came from. But imagine for a moment that we could slowly erase everything that appeared during recorded history. Remove the borders first, then the modern cities, the medieval kingdoms, the Roman roads, the Greek settlements, the Celtic strongholds, and every written name left behind by the people who once called this continent home. Keep traveling backward, thousands upon thousands of years, until even the familiar civilizations of the ancient world disappear. What remains is a Europe almost impossible for us to recognize, a vast landscape of forests, frozen plains, mountains, rivers, and coastlines inhabited by small groups of human beings who had no concept of France, Germany, Spain, Britain, or even Europe itself. And somewhere inside this forgotten world lies the answer to one of the most fascinating questions in human history. Where did Europeans really come from? For centuries, historians and archaeologists tried to answer that question using the evidence the ancient world left behind. Bones buried beneath the earth, stone tools scattered across forgotten camps, fragments of pottery, mysterious burial sites, ruined settlements, and traces of languages whose earliest speakers disappeared long before anyone thought to record their names. These discoveries revealed extraordinary things, but they also created mysteries that archaeology alone could not always solve. When a completely new style of pottery suddenly appeared across a region, had new people arrived, or had the existing population simply adopted a new idea? When farming began spreading through lands previously inhabited by hunter-gatherers, were agricultural techniques passing peacefully from one community to another, or were farmers themselves moving into Europe and bringing their families, animals, crops, beliefs, and traditions with them? For thousands of years, the people buried beneath European soil could not answer those questions. Their bones could tell us something about how they lived and died, but much of their identity remained hidden. Then, in recent decades, scientists learned how to recover and analyze ancient DNA, and suddenly those silent remains began revealing a history no ancient historian had ever written down. What emerged was far more complicated than the idea of one ancient European population slowly developing into the peoples we recognize today. Ancient DNA revealed a continent repeatedly transformed by migration, population expansion, isolation, survival, and mixture. Groups arrived from distant regions and encountered communities already living there. Some lived beside one another for generations. Some mixed and formed new populations. In other periods, the genetic landscape changed dramatically as newcomers expanded across enormous territories. Populations that had survived for thousands of years sometimes became only faint traces within the people who came afterward. Europe was not a sealed world occupied by one unchanging population. It was a crossroads, repeatedly reshaped by people moving across landscapes that had no political borders to stop them. Long before Rome raised its armies, before Greek cities appeared along the Mediterranean, before the Celts, Germanic peoples, or Vikings entered written history, hunter-gatherers were already living across Europe and surviving some of the most extreme climatic changes our species had ever experienced. Later, farming populations with deep connections to Anatolia began moving into southeastern Europe, bringing cultivated crops, domesticated animals, permanent settlements, and an entirely different relationship with the land. Thousands of years later, another major transformation arrived from the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, as populations carrying substantial ancestry associated with the Pontic-Caspian steppe expanded westward and contributed another important layer to Europe's genetic history. These were not simply ideas traveling from village to village. They were people, families, communities, generations, moving across enormous distances, encountering strangers, forming relationships, competing for resources, exchanging technologies, and leaving descendants behind. But even these great migrations do not take us back far enough, because when the earliest Homo sapiens entered Europe, they were not entering an empty continent. Someone else was already there. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals had survived Europe's changing climates, hunted across its landscapes, raised their young, cared for members of their communities, and adapted to environments that could be brutally unforgiving. Then our own species arrived, and for a period of prehistoric time, two different kinds of humans shared parts of the same world. What happened between them was once almost completely mysterious, but genetics has revealed something extraordinary. Their encounter did not end only in competition and disappearance. They also interbred, leaving traces of Neanderthal ancestry that remain in many people living outside Africa today. In other words, a meeting that took place tens of thousands of years ago still survives inside the human genome. And this is where the question of European origins becomes much stranger than it first appears, because the farther backward we travel, the less useful our modern identities become. There were no Germans, Spaniards, Italians, French, British, Greeks, or Scandinavians wandering across prehistoric Europe. Those identities belonged to futures these ancient people could never have imagined. Instead, there were populations whose original names are lost forever. Communities whose languages disappeared without leaving a single written sentence, and people whose entire worlds now survive only through scattered artifacts, ancient skeletons, and fragments of DNA recovered from the dead. Some of them may have believed their people had always occupied their land. Some may have looked at mountains, rivers, and valleys and thought those places belonged permanently to them. Yet thousands of years later, their names are gone, their languages are silent, and the genetic landscape around them has changed again and again. So perhaps asking who were the first Europeans is not quite the right question. The deeper mystery is how repeated waves of migration, survival, isolation, population change, and human mixing eventually created the complex genetic landscape we now call Europe. To uncover that story, we have to travel beyond kings and empires, beyond written history, beyond agriculture itself, into a time when the continent was shaped by ice, wilderness, and populations whose existence was almost completely forgotten until modern science began bringing their stories back into the light. And if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten origins of people, nations, and civilizations, subscribe to the Historixa and join us as we travel beyond the familiar pages of history to discover the stories buried beneath them. Here, we do not simply ask what happened. We search for the people who came before us, the migrations that transformed the world, and the ancient connections still hidden within humanity today. Because sometimes, to understand who we are, we first have to discover who came before us. And our search for the origins of Europe begins much earlier than Rome, Greece, or any civilization recorded in history. It begins in a cold and ancient world, tens of thousands of years ago, when our ancestors entered Europe and discovered that they were not alone. Another kind of human was already there, watching the same skies, walking the same valleys, and surviving in the shadow of the Ice Age. They were the Neanderthals. For a very long time, the Neanderthals were imagined as primitive creatures, standing somewhere between ape and human, hunched figures surviving in caves while waiting for supposedly more intelligent Homo sapiens to arrive and replace them. It was a convenient image, but it was also deeply misleading. The more archaeologists have discovered about Neanderthals, the more difficult it has become to dismiss them as simple or unintelligent. They were remarkably successful humans adapted to some of the most demanding environments of prehistoric Eurasia, and they survived there for hundreds of thousands of years. Their bodies were different from ours in noticeable ways. They tended to be shorter and more powerfully built, with broad chests, strong limbs, large noses, and distinctive skull shapes. These features were not signs of inferiority. Many were likely connected to the environments in which they lived and the demands placed upon their bodies. Europe during the Ice Age could be an unforgiving place, and survival required knowledge that could not be learned from books or maps. It had to be carried through generations, remembered in landscapes, hunting routes, seasons, animal behavior, sources of stone, safe shelters, and the ability to make fire and tools in a world where a single serious mistake could be fatal. Neanderthals occupied parts of Europe and Western Asia long before Homo sapiens became established in the region. They hunted large animals, manufactured sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, and appear to have cared for injured or vulnerable members of their communities. Some individuals survived significant injuries and physical limitations for years, suggesting that they received support from others. There is also evidence that Neanderthals used pigments and engaged in behaviors that may have had symbolic meaning, although exactly what those behaviors meant to them remains difficult to know. We should be cautious about imagining their minds as identical to ours, but equally cautious about treating them as creatures without culture, emotion, planning, or social bonds. They were another human population with their own long history. And when Homo sapiens began expanding into Eurasia, the newcomers were entering territories Neanderthals understood far better than they did. Our own species, Homo sapiens, had emerged in Africa much earlier, and over time some populations began expanding beyond the continent. This was not a single dramatic march in which one enormous group left Africa and immediately populated the rest of the world. Human dispersal was far more complicated. Different populations moved at different times. Some expansions left limited genetic traces. Routes changed with climate, and communities could move forward, retreat, become isolated, or disappear. But eventually, populations of Homo sapiens expanded successfully across Eurasia, and by roughly 45,000 years ago, modern humans were present across parts of Europe. Their arrival created one of the most extraordinary periods in our evolutionary history, because for some time, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occupied overlapping regions of Eurasia. Two human populations, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary history, encountered one another. We cannot know what the first encounters looked like. There were no witnesses who could leave us a written account, and archaeology gives us only fragments. Perhaps some meetings ended in avoidance. Others may have involved conflict over territory or resources. Some must have involved closer contact because genetics has preserved evidence that stone tools alone could never reveal. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. Today, many populations outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal-derived ancestry, although the amount varies between individuals and populations. That genetic inheritance is one of the most intimate pieces of evidence we possess about prehistoric human contact. Somewhere in the distant past, people from these populations met, had children, and some of those children had descendants whose lineages continued across thousands of generations. This discovery transformed the way scientists understood the disappearance of the Neanderthals. For years, the story was often presented as a simple replacement. Modern humans arrived, Neanderthals vanished, and one human species succeeded while the other failed. The reality appears more complicated. Neanderthals did disappear as a distinct population around 40,000 years ago, but not every part of their biological legacy disappeared with them. Some of it was absorbed into expanding Homo sapiens populations. Their disappearance probably cannot be explained by one single cause either. Climate instability, small and fragmented populations, demographic pressures, competition, disease, differences in social networks, and assimilation may all have played roles, and researchers continue to debate their relative importance. What matters for our story is that by the time Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct human population, Homo sapiens had established a lasting presence in Europe, and the continent entered another long and difficult period of human history. These early modern Europeans did not belong to any modern nation or ethnic group. Even calling them Europeans is useful only geographically. Their world did not contain Europe in the political or cultural sense that exists today. They lived in small communities separated by landscapes that could be enormous and dangerous. The climate repeatedly shifted. Ice sheets expanded and retreated. Temperatures fell and rose. Forests disappeared and returned. Animal populations moved, and human populations followed them. During the coldest periods of the last ice age, enormous areas of northern Europe became difficult or impossible for humans to inhabit permanently. Communities withdrew toward regions where survival was more possible, particularly southern refuges, and when conditions improved, people expanded northward again. This constant movement is essential to understanding the genetic history of Europe because there was never a single prehistoric population sitting still while thousands of years passed around it. Human groups expanded, contracted, became isolated, encountered other populations, and sometimes disappeared. Ancient DNA has revealed episodes of population turnover even among Europe's hunter-gatherers, showing that the people who lived in one region at one point in the Ice Age were not necessarily the direct and unchanged ancestors of those living there thousands of years later. Europe was already experiencing demographic transformations long before agriculture arrived. Imagine the continent around 20,000 years ago, near the coldest phase of the last glacial period. Much of northern Europe lay beneath enormous ice sheets or existed as environments hostile to sustained human settlement. Sea levels were far lower because so much of the world's water was locked in ice. Coastlines extended farther outward, and landscapes now buried beneath seas were dry land. Britain was not always an island separated from continental Europe by the English Channel. A broad, low-lying landscape, later known as Doggerland, connected Britain to mainland Europe, and people and animals could move across areas that today lie beneath the North Sea. To the humans living there, this was not a lost world. It was simply home. Their lives depended upon movement and memory. They needed to know where animals migrated, where edible plants could be found, where high-quality stone could be obtained for tools, where rivers could be crossed, and where shelter could be found when conditions changed. The knowledge required to survive was passed from generation to generation, and although their communities may appear simple when judged only by what survived archaeologically, their understanding of the landscape must have been extraordinarily detailed. Every valley, river, migration route, and seasonal change could mean the difference between survival and death. Then the climate began to warm. The transformation was gradual on the scale of human history, but dramatic on the scale of landscapes. Ice sheets retreated. Plants recolonized regions that had been barren. Forests expanded. Animals moved into new territories, and human populations followed. Areas that had been abandoned during the coldest periods became habitable again. Hunter-gatherer groups expanded northward, and Europe slowly changed from an Ice Age world dominated in many regions by open environments into one increasingly covered by forests. This environmental transformation also changed human life. Hunting strategies adapted as ecosystems changed. The animals available in dense woodland differed from those that had roamed open Ice Age plains. Rivers, lakes, forests, and coastlines provided new resources. Communities developed technologies suited to these environments, and over thousands of years, hunter-gatherer populations established themselves across much of post-glacial Europe. Ancient DNA has given scientists glimpses of these people that archaeology alone could never provide. Genetic studies have identified different hunter-gatherer ancestries across prehistoric Europe, reflecting complicated histories of survival, isolation, expansion, and mixture. One ancestry frequently discussed by researchers is associated with Western European hunter-gatherers who became widespread after the Ice Age, while other hunter-gatherer populations lived farther east and north. These labels are useful scientific shorthand, but they should not be mistaken for the names of actual tribes. We do not know what these people called themselves. They probably did not see themselves as members of enormous genetic categories extending across a continent. Their identities would have been local, personal, linguistic, familial, and cultural, most of which has disappeared beyond recovery. Some ancient genetic discoveries have also challenged modern assumptions about what prehistoric Europeans looked like. Traits associated today with particular regions did not necessarily appear together in the same combinations thousands of years ago. Skin pigmentation, eye pigmentation, hair characteristics, and other traits changed in frequency over long periods as populations mixed and natural selection operated under different environments and diets. This is one reason we must resist imagining prehistoric Europe simply as a primitive version of modern Europe. It was populated by people whose combinations of ancestry and physical characteristics could differ significantly from those common in the same regions today. For thousands of years after the Ice Age, hunter-gatherers continued to live across Europe, adapting to forests, rivers, coastlines, islands, and plains. Their ancestors had survived enormous climatic changes. They knew their landscapes intimately. From their perspective, there may have been little reason to imagine that their way of life would ever disappear. Generation after generation had hunted, gathered, fished, traveled, raised children, buried the dead, and passed knowledge forward. The forests and rivers must have seemed permanent. Their world had survived the ice and returned with the warming climate. But far to the southeast, beyond the communities of European hunter-gatherers, another transformation had already begun, and unlike the slow retreat of the glaciers, this change would be carried by human hands. In parts of Southwest Asia, communities were experimenting with something that would eventually alter human civilization more profoundly than almost any development that came before it. Plants that had once been gathered in the wild were increasingly cultivated. Animals that had once been hunted were increasingly managed and domesticated. People who had depended primarily on wild resources began living in more permanent settlements, storing food and reshaping the land around them. Agriculture did not appear suddenly, nor was it invented by one person or in one village. It emerged through a long process involving many communities and generations. But once farming societies became established, they created a completely different relationship between people and landscape. Over time, farming populations expanded westward. By the 7th millennium BCE, agricultural communities were established in parts of Anatolia and the Aegean world, and from there farming spread into southeastern Europe. For decades, one of archaeology's great questions was whether this expansion represented the movement of ideas or the movement of people. Had Europe's hunter-gatherers simply learned farming from their neighbors, or had new populations entered Europe and brought agriculture with them? Ancient DNA provided a powerful answer. The spread of farming into Europe involved substantial migration by people whose ancestry was closely connected to early farming populations of Anatolia and the Aegean. These farmers were genetically distinguishable from many of the hunter-gatherer populations already living in Europe. They did not merely send seeds, animals, and knowledge across an invisible frontier. People themselves moved, families traveled. Communities established new settlements. Generation by generation, the agricultural world expanded farther into the continent. And wherever these farmers went, they entered landscapes that were already inhabited. This was not the discovery of an empty Europe. It was the meeting of two very different ways of life, both with deep histories behind them. On one side were hunter-gatherers whose ancestors had survived the Ice Age and whose knowledge of Europe's forests, rivers, animals, and seasons stretched back countless generations. On the other were farming communities carrying crops, livestock, technologies, and traditions shaped by a different history farther southeast. Their encounter would unfold over centuries and would not be the same everywhere. In some regions, farmers and hunter-gatherers may have lived near one another while maintaining substantial separation. In others, contact increased and ancestry mixed. Some hunter-gatherer communities adopted aspects of farming, while farming populations incorporated local hunter-gatherer ancestry over time. But beneath all these regional differences, something enormous was happening. Europe's demographic landscape was changing. Farming allowed communities to produce food differently and, under many conditions, support larger populations. Permanent settlements became increasingly important. Fields appeared where forests had once stood. Domesticated animals moved through landscapes previously dominated by wild species. Houses, storage structures, tools, and burial traditions reflected new patterns of life. Children were born into communities where the rhythm of existence was tied increasingly to planting, harvesting, livestock, and land. The hunter-gatherer world did not vanish overnight. In some regions, it persisted for long periods, and the relationship between farmers and foragers was far more complicated than a simple story of one group replacing another. Yet, across much of Europe, ancestry associated with early farmers became widespread. The continent had experienced one of its great prehistoric population transformations. And still, the story was nowhere near finished. Because thousands of years after farmers began reshaping Europe, another movement was gathering far beyond the agricultural settlements of Central and Western Europe. To the east stretched an immense zone of grasslands running across Eurasia, a landscape of extraordinary distances where mobility could become a powerful advantage. Communities living in and around the Pontic-Caspian steppe developed lifeways adapted to this open environment, raising livestock and moving through territories that connected Europe with regions farther east. Then, during the 3rd millennium BCE, something happened that would once again transform Europe's genetic landscape. Populations carrying large amounts of steppe-related ancestry began expanding westward. The archaeological record had long shown major cultural changes during this period, including the spread of burial traditions and material cultures associated with groups such as the Yamnaya horizon and, farther west, the corded Ware complex. But once ancient DNA entered the picture, the scale of demographic change became impossible to ignore. Individuals associated with corded Ware contexts in parts of Central and Northern Europe carried substantial ancestry related to steppe populations, revealing that this transformation involved major movements of people. The distances involved were remarkable. Within a relatively short period on the prehistoric timescale, steppe-related ancestry appeared across enormous areas of Europe. Communities changed, new networks formed, existing populations interacted with newcomers, and once again, the continent became something different from what it had been before. This migration is especially important because steppe-related ancestry remains a major component of many present-day European populations, although its proportion varies geographically and modern Europeans cannot be reduced to any single ancient source. By this point in our journey, a pattern should be becoming clear. The genetic history of Europe resembles layers deposited over time, but even that metaphor is imperfect because the layers continually mixed with one another. Hunter-gatherer ancestry did not simply disappear when farmers arrived. Farmer ancestry did not disappear when steppe-related populations expanded. Instead, populations interacted and recombined, producing new genetic landscapes that were themselves altered by later movements. And this is where another mystery enters the story: the languages of Europe. Today, most languages spoken across Europe belong to the Indo-European language family. English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, German, Greek, Polish, Russian, and many others ultimately belong to branches of this enormous linguistic family, while several European languages such as Basque, Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian do not. For generations, scholars have debated how Indo-European languages spread and where earlier forms of these languages originated. One influential hypothesis connects important stages of Indo-European dispersal with populations of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and the discovery of major steppe-related migrations into Europe gave new weight to parts of that model. But genetics cannot tell us what language an individual spoke. DNA contains biological ancestry, not vocabulary. A skeleton can reveal genetic relationships and sometimes biological traits, but it cannot tell us what words that person used for mother, sky, horse, river, or death. Archaeology, historical linguistics, and genetics must therefore be considered together, and even then uncertainties remain. It is tempting to transform every genetic population into a linguistic identity, but human history rarely behaves so neatly. Languages can spread without enormous population replacement. Populations can adopt the languages of smaller but socially powerful groups. Multilingual communities can exist for generations. Languages can disappear while ancestry survives. Still, the convergence of archaeological, linguistic, and genetic evidence has made the prehistoric steppe central to discussions about the formation of later European populations and the spread of at least some branches of Indo-European languages. What began as movement across grasslands became part of a transformation whose effects would echo into the Bronze Age and beyond. By now, the Europe of the earliest hunter-gatherers had changed almost beyond recognition. The descendants of Ice Age populations had mixed with farming populations whose deeper ancestry lay toward Anatolia. Those communities, in turn, encountered populations carrying steppe-related ancestry. New societies formed from these interactions, and over the following centuries, Europe became a complex mosaic of communities linked by trade, migration, conflict, marriage, technology, and language. Metals changed economies and warfare. Long-distance trade connected distant regions. Bronze objects moved across networks spanning hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Amber from northern Europe traveled south. Materials, technologies, and ideas moved in multiple directions. Later, Iron Age societies emerged, and populations known to written history began appearing more clearly in the archaeological and historical record. Greeks, Romans, Celts, Germanic-speaking peoples, and many others entered the stories preserved by literate civilizations. But even these familiar names can create an illusion of permanence. The people whom Roman writers called by particular names were not necessarily single, genetically uniform populations, and their identities could shift according to politics, geography, language, alliances, and the perceptions of outsiders. The same caution applies to later migrations. The Roman Empire itself moved soldiers, slaves, merchants, administrators, and families across enormous distances. Cities became places where people from different parts of Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia could meet. After the Western Roman political order fragmented, migrations and expansions associated with various Germanic-speaking groups changed parts of Europe again. Slavic-speaking populations expanded across large areas of Central and Eastern Europe. Norse voyagers connected Scandinavia with Britain, Ireland, continental Europe, the North Atlantic, and routes reaching deep into Eastern Europe. Steppe peoples continued to move westward at different periods. Mediterranean networks connected southern Europe to North Africa and the Near East. No point arrived when migration simply stopped and the populations of Europe became permanently fixed. This is why trying to find one ancient population and declare it the true ancestor of Europeans misunderstands what ancient DNA has revealed. There was no single moment when the Europeans appeared. Modern European populations emerged from long histories of mixture, local continuity, migration, isolation, demographic expansion, disease, warfare, marriage, trade, and cultural change. The relative contribution of ancient populations differs from region to region, and even neighboring communities can have distinct demographic histories. Southern Europe experienced different patterns of contact with the Mediterranean world than Scandinavia. Eastern Europe was shaped by movements that did not affect Western Europe in the same way. Islands could experience periods of isolation followed by dramatic migration. Mountain valleys could preserve local patterns while nearby plains became corridors for movement. And yet, beneath all this diversity, ancient DNA has revealed connections that would have been unimaginable to the people themselves. A person walking through Europe today may carry fragments of ancestry connected to hunter-gatherers who survived after the Ice Age, early farmers whose ancestors moved westward from Anatolia and the Aegean, and pastoralist populations linked to the steppe, alongside many later contributions accumulated through thousands of years of migration. These components are not separate people living inside us, nor should they be interpreted as pure ancient races. They are statistical traces of populations that were themselves complex and changing. This matters because genetics can easily be misunderstood when we try to force ancient evidence into modern political or racial categories. Prehistoric populations did not organize themselves according to the identities we use today. A person living 6,000 years ago could not have imagined the borders that would eventually divide Europe. The concept of nationality as we understand it would have meant nothing to them. Even the physical landscape was different. Seas covered lands that had once been inhabited. Forests grew where grasslands had existed. Rivers changed course. Settlements rose, vanished, and were forgotten. The deeper we travel into European prehistory, the more temporary everything begins to look. Populations that once seemed permanent disappeared. Languages that may have been spoken by thousands of people vanished without leaving readable texts. Communities that controlled territories for centuries became layers of soil. People migrated into lands occupied by others only for their descendants to experience new migrations generations later. Every group inherited a world shaped by people who came before them, and every group changed that world for those who came afterward. Perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden within the genetic history of Europe. Human identity feels permanent when viewed from inside a single lifetime, but across thousands of years it is constantly moving. The people we call ancient were not standing still, waiting to become us. They were living their own lives, making decisions for reasons we may never know, traveling in search of resources, security, opportunity, land, family, or survival. They could not see the future they were creating. The Neanderthal, watching unfamiliar Homo sapiens enter a valley, could not know that traces of Neanderthal DNA would still exist tens of thousands of years later. The hunter-gatherer following animals across a landscape now beneath the North Sea could not know that the sea would eventually swallow that world. The Anatolian farmer moving toward southeastern Europe could not know that descendants of farming communities would eventually live from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The steppe pastoralist looking across the grasslands could not know that migrations connected to those populations would become one of the central questions in the study of European ancestry and language. None of them knew they were creating the genetic history of Europe. They were simply living. And generation after generation, their lives became our evidence. A tooth buried in a cave, a skeleton beneath a stone monument, a grave on the steppe, a fragment of bone in an ancient settlement. For thousands of years, these remains seemed silent, But inside them were molecular records of relationships, migrations, and encounters that had been forgotten by history. That may be the strangest part of this entire story. Written history remembers kings, battles, empires, and monuments, but genetics can sometimes preserve traces of people whose names were never recorded at all. A farmer who lived 5,000 years ago may have left no palace, no inscription, and no legend, yet some fragment of ancestry connected to populations like theirs can survive across thousands of generations. The great majority of our ancestors were not famous. They were ordinary people who survived long enough to have children, and those children continued the chain. So when we return to our original question, where did Europeans really come from? The answer is not a single place on a map. It is not one tribe, one migration, or one civilization. Europe was shaped by repeated movements of people across tens of thousands of years, beginning with hunter-gatherers who survived the Ice Age, transformed by farmers arriving from the southeast, reshaped again by populations connected to the steppe, and continually altered by countless later migrations and encounters. The Europe of today is therefore not the endpoint of one ancient bloodline. It is the temporary result of an unfinished human story. Because migration did not end in the Bronze Age, population change did not end with Rome. Human beings never stopped moving, meeting, separating, and mixing. The borders we see today are extraordinarily recent compared with the age of the populations beneath them, and if history teaches us anything, it is that those borders will never explain the full story of the people who live within them. To discover where Europeans came from, we had to travel backward until Europe itself disappeared. And what we found was not one person waiting at the beginning. We found many, people who survived ice, people who crossed mountains and seas, people who carried seeds into new lands, people who followed herds across enormous grasslands, people who met strangers and sometimes became family, people whose names disappeared while traces of their existence remained. The modern map may divide Europe into nations, but beneath those borders lies another map, older, deeper, and almost invisible, a map written through migration, ancestry, archaeology, and time. And the more of that map we uncover, the clearer one truth becomes. The history of Europe was never the history of people standing still. It was the history of people moving. Eventually, if we continue following the genetic trail far enough backward, the question of where Europeans came from begins to dissolve into something much larger. Because Europe was never the beginning of this story, it was one destination in a human journey that had already been unfolding for an extraordinary length of time. Long before anyone walked through the forests of prehistoric France, crossed the plains of Central Europe, settled along the Mediterranean coast, or followed herds across the northern wilderness, the deeper story of our species had begun somewhere else entirely. It leads us back toward Africa, where Homo sapiens emerged hundreds of thousands of years ago within populations whose own histories were already complex, changing, and interconnected. From there, over immense stretches of time, some human populations expanded beyond Africa and gradually entered new environments across Eurasia. This was not one enormous migration in which a single group suddenly left Africa and marched toward Europe. It was a complicated process involving different populations, different periods of expansion, changing climates, failed dispersals, successful dispersals, isolation, reunion, and movement across landscapes that themselves were constantly changing. Generation after generation, people entered territories their ancestors had never seen, and eventually some of those journeys brought Homo sapiens into Europe. But even then, Europe was not empty. Neanderthals had already occupied parts of the continent and western Eurasia for an immense period of time, and when Homo sapiens encountered them, the meeting became part of our biological history. The evidence preserved in DNA tells us that these populations did not simply pass one another without contact. They interbred, and traces of that encounter survived long after Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population. From that point onward, the ancestry of the people living in Europe continued to change. Ice Age hunter-gatherers survived dramatic climatic shifts, expanded into newly habitable landscapes as glaciers retreated and formed populations whose genetic traces can still be detected today. Then, farming communities with deep connections to Anatolia and the Aegean moved into Europe, bringing not only agriculture, but people, families, traditions, animals, crops, and new ways of organizing life. They encountered the hunter-gatherers already living there, and over time the boundaries between these populations became less absolute as people mixed and new communities emerged. Thousands of years later, populations carrying substantial ancestry connected to the Pontic-Caspian steppe expanded westward, once again transforming the genetic landscape of large parts of Europe. And after them came countless other movements: Bronze Age networks, Iron Age populations, Roman expansion, migrations during late antiquity and the early medieval period, Slavic expansions, Norse voyages, Mediterranean connections, steppe movements, trade, conquest, marriage, displacement, and ordinary people simply searching for somewhere else to live. When all of these layers are placed together, the idea of discovering one original European population begins to seem almost impossible. Every time we think we have reached the beginning, another population stands behind the one we have found. The steppe populations had ancestors who had themselves emerged through earlier mixtures. The Anatolian farmers had ancestors shaped by populations and movements stretching deeper into Southwest Asian prehistory. European hunter-gatherers were descendants of people whose histories extended through the Ice Age and beyond. Homo sapiens themselves emerged from a much deeper African evolutionary history. And when some of those Homo sapiens entered Eurasia, they encountered other humans whose ancestors had followed their own evolutionary paths for hundreds of thousands of years. The farther backward we travel, the more every simple category begins to disappear. Perhaps this is why ancient DNA has changed our understanding of history so profoundly. It has shown us that ancestry is not a collection of perfectly separated lines running independently through time. It is more like an enormous river system, constantly dividing and reconnecting, with streams disappearing into others and new branches forming from populations that once seemed completely separate. A person living today may carry genetic traces connected to populations that would never have considered themselves part of the same people and may have lived thousands of years apart. Their descendants met later, and histories that had once been separate became permanently connected. This also reveals something important about the way we think about modern identity. When we look at someone today and call them Spanish, French, British, German, Italian, Greek, Polish, Scandinavian, or any other modern nationality, we are describing a real cultural and political identity, but we are not describing an ancient biological category that has existed unchanged since prehistory. Modern nations are young compared with the ancestry of the people who live inside them. Their borders are recent. Their languages have evolved, their cultures have absorbed influences from populations that arrived at different times and from different directions. Genetics doesn't make those identities meaningless, but it reminds us that cultural identity and deep ancestry are not the same thing. One belongs to communities, languages, histories, institutions, memories, and shared experiences. The other stretches backward through thousands of generations until almost every modern label loses its meaning. And perhaps the most mysterious part is that we are reconstructing this enormous story from people who never knew they were part of it. The hunter-gatherer buried beside a river did not know that thousands of years later scientists would extract DNA from their remains. The farmer moving through southeastern Europe did not know that their descendants would contribute ancestry to populations living far beyond the horizon. The pastoralist traveling across the steppe did not know that geneticists would one day detect evidence of those prehistoric movements across much of Europe. These people were not trying to create a continent. They were trying to survive, feed their families, find land, protect their communities, follow animals, raise livestock, escape danger, or search for opportunities in places they had never seen before. Most of them disappeared without leaving their names behind. There are no statues of them, no written biographies, no chronicles describing their lives. History remembers emperors because emperors built monuments and commanded people to write about them. But human ancestry was created overwhelmingly by ordinary people whose names vanished. Somewhere thousands of years ago, a woman carried her child across an unfamiliar landscape. Somewhere else, a family left a settlement and never returned. A young person joined another community and raised children there. A group followed animals across a valley. Farmers established a village farther west than their parents had ever traveled. A community crossed a river and discovered people speaking words they could not understand. These small decisions, repeated millions of times across thousands of years, eventually changed the genetic landscape of an entire continent. That is why the history revealed by ancient DNA feels so different from the history written in books. Written history often begins when kingdoms appear, when armies march, when rulers leave inscriptions, and when civilizations build monuments large enough to survive. Genetic history begins much earlier and follows people who left almost nothing behind. Sometimes all that remains is a tooth, a fragment of bone, a grave beneath forgotten soil, or a skeleton discovered accidentally thousands of years later. Yet inside those remains can survive evidence of journeys that no written document ever recorded. And when we finally return to the question we began with, where did Europeans really come from? Perhaps the most accurate answer is that they came from many places, at many different times, through countless human journeys that repeatedly transformed the continent. They came through Ice Age survival and post-glacial expansion, through Anatolian farming migrations and steppe movements, through ancient trade routes and imperial roads, through conquest and peaceful settlement, through marriages between strangers and communities merging across generations. Europe was never created by one people arriving once. It was assembled slowly through layers of human movement, and every layer contained older layers beneath it. The map we see today is therefore only the latest surface of something much deeper. Beneath the borders of modern Europe lies another map that cannot be drawn with simple political lines. It is a map of ancient migrations, forgotten populations, vanished languages, lost coastlines, abandoned settlements, and human connections stretching across continents. Some of those connections can now be detected through genetics. Others survive through archaeology or language. Many have disappeared forever. And perhaps that is what makes the search for our origins so powerful. The deeper we search for the people who came before us, the harder it becomes to see humanity as a collection of completely separate stories. Every population has a history behind it, and behind that history lies another migration, another encounter, another mixture, another group of people whose names we may never know. Europe was shaped by this process, but Europe is not unique in that respect. Human beings have always moved, adapted, separated, reunited, and created new identities from older ones. So Europe was never the beginning of the journey, and it is certainly not the end. It was one enormous meeting place within a much older human story, a story that began long before nations existed and continues every time people cross borders, build families, and create new communities. The ancient populations we have followed through this journey may be gone, but their history did not completely disappear. Pieces of it remain beneath the soil, inside forgotten graves, within the languages spoken today, and within the genetic inheritance carried forward by generations who never knew their names. And perhaps that is the final mystery hidden inside the question of where Europeans came from. We began by searching for an origin, expecting that somewhere deep in the past we might discover one people, one homeland, or one moment from which everything else emerged. Instead, the deeper we traveled, the more origins multiplied. Behind every population stood another population. Behind every homeland was an earlier journey. Behind every identity was a history of change. And what we eventually discovered was not a single beginning, but something far more human. An endless chain of movement, survival, encounter, and transformation, connecting people across tens of thousands of years. Europe was not simply inherited, it was continually created, and the people who created it were always moving. And once we follow that question far enough, the story leads us back to Africa, where Homo sapiens emerged hundreds of thousands of years ago before some populations gradually expanded beyond the continent and into the wider world. Europe was only one destination in that enormous human journey, reached after generations of movement through changing climates, unfamiliar landscapes, and encounters with other human populations. The people who eventually entered Europe carried with them ancestry shaped long before the word Europe could have meant anything at all, and from that moment forward, every new migration added another layer to an already ancient story. This is why modern European ancestry cannot be traced to one tribe, one migration, or one birthplace. It reflects countless generations of movement and mixture, from early Homo sapiens leaving Africa to hunter-gatherers surviving the Ice Age, farmers expanding from Anatolia, steppe populations moving westward, and the many migrations that followed. What we see today is not the final form of Europe, but only its latest moment. The genetic map continues to change because people continue to move, meet, form families, and carry pieces of distant histories with them. Europe was never created in a single event. It was assembled slowly, generation by generation, from human journeys that began long before anyone knew they were creating history. And that may be the most powerful lesson of all. When we look deeply enough into the past, history stops being only about kings, wars, and empires and becomes something much more personal. It becomes the story of ordinary people searching for food, safety, family, opportunity, and a place to call home, never knowing that thousands of years later we would still be searching for them. Their names are gone, their voices are silent, and many of their worlds have disappeared beneath forests, cities, farmland, and even the sea, but pieces of their story survived. And now, through archaeology, genetics, and the evidence they left behind, those forgotten people are slowly becoming visible again. If you enjoyed traveling this far into the forgotten origins of Europe, take a look at one of the suggested videos appearing on your screen now, because our journey into the hidden origins of humanity is only beginning. And if you haven't already, subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering the forgotten peoples, mysterious migrations, ancient civilizations, and extraordinary events that shaped the world we inherited. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being a part of the Historixa. Until our next journey into the past, remember, the deeper we search for where we came from, the more we discover how connected our stories have always been.